One of the hallmarks of social life is that we tend to rely on other people's behavior to tell us about them, but we rely on our own thoughts to tell us about us.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 215th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the workings of your own brain, including dealing with that greatest of joys and most annoying of annoyances. Drum roll, please. That is other people. I'm going to be talking with social psychology researcher Dr. Erica Boothby in this episode about several interesting social psychology studies that she's done about the cognitive biases that we humans share when thinking about other people and thinking about how other people may or may not be thinking about us. She coined a psychological term called the invisibility cloak, and that just reminded me back to Dungeons and Dragons. And was like, what the heck is this? Started reading about it, found it really interesting, thought this was episode worthy. I think you will agree. So not a whole lot of drugs coming up in this one, but as we are all social creatures, you will certainly find that this applies to you in your life. I'll be talking to Dr. Boothby in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, sort of an interesting counterpoint to how we think about other people is how we think about the voices inside our own heads. Not necessarily talking about things like schizophrenia, although this research does have applications there, but this is something that we all do. If you're not familiar with the term efference copies, you will be by the time that we finish the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So learning requires that we update our beliefs with new things, whether this is uncontroversial learning like a baby learning to stand upright and walk around, or much more abstract stuff, learning, gosh, I really had the wrong idea about Sally. The advantages of being right and not wrong are pretty obvious, but what might not be as straightforward is whether it's important to remember that we used to be wrong in the past. For the toddler, it doesn't necessarily matter if they remember how they used to think balance worked before they actually knew how to balance, but when it comes to other sorts of changes of mind, it's not quite as clear cut. Is it important that along with remembering whatever it is we just learned, we also remember what we used to think and the difference between those two? Is it helpful for us to be aware of the fact that we are fallible, and if maybe there's other mind changes that we might need to be open to in the future? Or maybe just the opposite's true. Maybe being aware of the fact that we have changed our minds in the past will make us constantly second guess ourselves and delay our actually taking action based on our current belief set. And these ideas were looked into in a recent study at Grand Valley State University, published in the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology, looking at what they called cognitive short-sightedness, one of the key features of which is an inability to recognize when one has changed one's mind. The authors say, if people show little awareness of changes in their own beliefs, they may erroneously conclude that their beliefs are more fixed than they actually are, and may consequently be less willing to engage with information that's contrary to their beliefs. They ran a couple of experiments to identify the prevalence of metacognitive awareness of belief change. In the first run of the experiment, the researchers had 128 subjects describe their beliefs on the efficacy of spanking kids. Then they read a text which for some of the people contradicted with what their initial beliefs were. And then they were questioned again both on what their beliefs were after the reading and what their beliefs had been before the reading. So what do you think now? And by the way, remind me again, what was that you thought beforehand? And fairly reliably, people made errors in describing their earlier beliefs, leaning closer towards what their beliefs wound up being after the new information had been added. They were wondering whether they could diminish this effect a little bit, so they ran a second experiment where before being presented with any new information, the people also were asked to give a pros and cons, arguments for and against spanking children, suspecting that maybe if the people were forced to be a little bit more explicit about what their prior held beliefs were, where those beliefs might come from, that might help their old ideas stick in their memory a little bit better. With that tweak to the experiment, they ran essentially the same experiment again, and even having listed those pros and cons, it didn't really do anything to change people's tendency to misremember their old beliefs. So this is, we've always been at war with East Asia from 1984, or the toddler who says, I've always known how to walk.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Dr. Bill from the USA says, I started listening to SDS because of its earlier episodes on neurofeedback. They did not disappoint and gave me some great ways to help explain to my clients what neurofeedback does and how it works. Kudos. And James 8 from the UK says, extremely informative and a great selection of guests. If you're new to the podcast, it is well worth going back and checking out some of the earlier episodes. Well, thanks, James. Thanks, Dr. Bill. And thanks to everybody that's been helping to spread the word. An update on things with Axon Labs. I told you last week that we are winding things down there, are selling out our final supplies of Nexus and Mitogen. Mitogen at this point is now gone. I think when people heard about it last week on the podcast, the final stock went out pretty fast. Nexus, we've got a bit more of. We're doing a sell-down sale, reducing the price day by day. So it's a little bit of a game of chicken. The longer you wait, the cheaper it gets. But of course, the longer you wait, the greater the chance that there won't be any left to buy. At the time of this recording, we've reduced the base price for one bottle from $60 down to $58. That's going to tick down at $1 a day. And of course, there's discounts for multi-bottle purchases. Not sure how long it's going to last at this rate, but of course, you can always go by axonlabs.io to see what the price is today. The daily price drop will take place at 7 a.m. Pacific time. So if you're really trying to get on the cutting edge of that price drop, then set your timers appropriately. And in ongoing news over at Vitamonk.com, still with the month of January, there's the deal going on there that any new subscriptions entitle you to trying out anything else from their catalog at the 3-month anniversary of that subscription being set up. So at the 3-month mark, the 6-month mark, 9 months, etc., as long as that subscription's alive, you get to cherry pick something new each time one of those anniversaries rolls around. No special coupon codes or anything like that, but that is limited to subscriptions that start in the month of January 2018. So if you're listening to this as a historical episode, you've already missed it, sorry. But if it's still January, then head on over there to Vitamonk.com.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I think most of us are fascinated to some degree with optical illusions. And what's really neat about optical illusions is that you can look at them, you can know that what you're looking at is an optical illusion, and yet that cognitive understanding of it does nothing to make the illusion go away, which is both flummoxing but also pretty cool in a way, because it's kind of obvious proof for everybody to see that our senses are not infallible, that we can make mistakes. That optical illusion with the dress of the various colors that different people would see differently that went around a couple of years ago, maybe the coolest example of that really becoming a phenomenon. But that same aspect of illusions, and that even when we know that they exist, we still can't see through them, that applies to other types of illusions as well. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about social illusions, which is kind of the tie that binds together the work of Dr. Erica Boothby. Dr. Boothby has recently graduated from Yale University, currently doing postdoc work at Cornell, and she seems to have a gift for naming things. She came up with a name I mentioned, the invisibility cloak. We're also going to be talking about the liking gap and other social illusions that she will break down for us in the coming interview. And most of this tends to be good news. It's kind of good news if you're a stalker, too. One of the things that we'll find out is that the people that you're thinking about, that you think, that person's probably not thinking about me, they might be thinking about you, but they're probably not thinking about the pizza stain on your shirt. So a lot of surprises, paradoxes, and I think universally interesting findings coming up next as we talk about social illusions with Dr. Erica Boothby.
I think social life is obviously one of the most important aspects of human life, and having great social interactions and social connections with other people is a really important, both for our psychological well-being, but also for our physical well-being. It can affect things like longevity, health outcomes. So it's really important that it goes well, which is why it's so interesting that we make all kinds of errors when it comes to social life. So I'm very interested in the kinds of things that we do wrong and things that we could also improve on and correct to improve our social lives.
Is there reason to believe that some of the things that we are doing wrong in the sense of inaccurately, like it doesn't actually conform to reality, but they might still be adaptive, the wrong thing for the right reason?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That's definitely a possibility, and it probably depends on the specific kind of error that we're talking about. But I would say when it comes to some of the things that I've been looking at in terms of how much we think about other people and how much we believe they think about and pay attention to us, it seems like what we're really doing a lot of the time is projecting our attention onto other people. So it's almost like whatever we're attending to and focused on, we assume others are too. And you can imagine ways in which that could be adaptive in terms of assuming that we're starting from the same baseline, that everyone has the same information coming at us and that we're perceiving the world in a very objective way. And that others are also in touch with that reality, because that could help us to coordinate, communicate, cooperate, all these important things. But it can also lead us astray, right? When we go too far in making this assumption.
Right. And we're freaking out like everybody else is going to notice this thing that I'm worried about being embarrassed about. Everybody's looking at that thing, and it's a conspiracy of silence that they're not overtly laughing at me, that kind of feeling.
Yeah, exactly. The example I always like to give is when you have something like a stain on your shirt and you're just so paranoid and you're worried that everyone's noticing it and they're making all kinds of negative judgments and attributions about you as a result. But in reality, they all have their own coffee stains. They have their own versions of this that they're worried worried about and that you're not even noticing. And so we're oblivious to each other's concerns in this kind of way. But I think that sometimes this heightened concern about it can also get in our way. So for example, we've run some studies recently in the lab where we bring in two strangers and we have them have a conversation, just a short conversation, and then we separate them and we ask them questions about what they thought about one another and what they believed the other person thought about them. And what we see is that people are very focused on specific things that they said during the interaction or behaviors they did, and they're very worried about how they came off in these kinds of moments. But when other people are evaluating them, the other people are making evaluations at a much higher level. They're just noticing global kinds of assessments like their personality traits and things like that. And so it just really goes to show that we are very hyper-focused on specific things that others aren't focused on. And that could lead us to overcorrect in certain ways going into our next interactions in ways that aren't really necessary, it turns out.
In that study, the people were previously unknown to one another, and I can kind of see where if you're first meeting somebody, you're just trying to get a global picture of them and not zooming in for the fine details. Have you done, or has anybody else done, sort of a parallel study with people that are already well known to one another, where all the background information is kind of already there to be accessed, and seeing if these mistaken assumptions we make about what the other person thinks are still so far off?
That's interesting. I haven't looked at that in our lab, so we haven't actually brought in people who know one another and had them undergo a similar sort of situation. But I would imagine that it might be attenuated with people who know one another because they're not going to be making these first impressions and concerned about their first impression, which seems like an especially freaky situation. But I think that they still are probably going to be prone to focus on different things than the other person is.
Yeah.
Although they may be more on the same page, I bet there's still room for some error there too.
I guess, is this sort of like an anecdotal study where you just ask people afterwards what they were worried about and what they think the other person was worried about, or how's the actual mechanism of the study gone?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we haven't asked explicitly about their worries or what they're concerned about, because that would really focus them on the things that they're worried about. And we want to find out in a more sort of sneaky way what kinds of things they're actually worried about by just asking them how they thought that interaction went. And so to the extent that they volunteer information about their concerns without us directing them, I think that provides stronger evidence that they're actually concerned and they're not just able to talk about it when we ask about it explicitly.
This seems like it would be a hard thing to study quantitatively. What can you describe about the variance that you've seen between people?
Right. So you can ask how people evaluate one another on scales. Psychologists, we love scales.
Right.
We use a lot of them. So we have, 1 to 7 point scale, and you just have people assess one another on this scale. It sounds kind of weird to boil down a lot of these different kinds of detailed judgments into general kind of scale, but you definitely can, and people find it very easy to use.
Yeah.
And we ask different kinds of questions, like, would you want to interact with this person again in the future? Right. And they can say whether or not they would be interested in that. And so you can get at people's assessments in this kind of way that's quantified. And you can also actually ask people for their thoughts about a lot of things, and they can provide them in a free response kind of format. And then you can code those. You can have a separate group of people code their responses for how positive or negative they are, or different kinds of content, how concerned they seem about how they came off, for example. And that's another way of kind of getting at this more empirically with hard data.
I assume that there are certain people that think everybody likes them, and there are other people, kind of the Eeyore types, that assume that nobody likes them and things like that. Like, how did you kind of get things on an even playing field?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's all kinds of psychological batteries that you can use to test people's, what we like to call individual difference measures, which is just their personality traits. So there's things like self-esteem, narcissism, which may be kind of what you're getting at. You think everyone likes you and wants to be around you, and you can measure these and you can see whether or not they moderate the effect. So do people who are, for example, high in narcissism think that other people like them more, are paying more attention to them, et cetera, than people who are low in narcissism? So that's one way of kind of sussing it out. And what we see time and time again with these effects is basically that you see the same effect across all kinds of different people. So kind of writ large, if you average across different personality types, you see this same effect emerge. But when we try splitting the different populations by the extreme ends of the personality types, so high narcissism, low narcissism, for example, we actually aren't seeing huge differences either. There are some slight differences, but it tends to not be a huge help in explaining the variability in the data.
How might you turn this into a prescriptive recommendation for how people adjust their social behavior?
That's a tough question. I think it can be extremely difficult to get outside of our own heads. Actually, there's a great quote from George Carlin, the comedian. Have you ever noticed that anyone driving slower than you is an idiot, and anyone going faster than you is a maniac?
I don't think he used the term maniac. I think he had even more colorful language, but yeah.
Yeah, this is the PC version. So I think we tend to really think that our reactions and experiences are very objective and the others aren't. And so I think the best way potentially to gain insight into other people's minds is really just to ask them and learn about what they're thinking about. It can be hard to get feedback about yourself from other people. So I think that's one of the tricky parts is we're all very cautious and tiptoeing around each other's egos, and we don't want to give people feedback that they may perceive negatively or as being critical about them. And so it can be hard to get the kind of feedback we need to then improve on the way that we do things socially. And so that can be one of the challenges. And I know there are different methods for providing this kind of feedback in, for example, like corporate context at work, but it has its challenges.
Yeah, it's like only your really good friends will tell you when you have a piece of parsley stuck in your teeth.
Exactly. Yeah, that friend's a keeper. If they tell you that, you got to keep them around.
So tell us about the invisibility cloak for Harry Potter fans or Dungeons and Dragons players. They're going to have their own ideas, but you're going somewhere a little different. For human cognitive biases, what are we talking about here?
So we have a couple of different ways of getting at this invisibility cloak illusion, which is just the belief that others are not paying nearly as much attention to you as you're paying to them. And maybe just to zoom out for a second, it's helpful to think about this in a real world context where it happens frequently is something like, say you're at a cafe and you're working on your laptop and you're just sort of plugging away doing your work. At some point you look up from your screen and you survey the room around you. You see that there's some guy picking up his latte and someone else adding sugar to their drink, whatever. You just sort of observe the things that are happening around you, take note of them, and then you return to your work, get focused on what you're doing again. And what you really don't realize in that moment is that that's when all the eyes in the cafe look up and are actually watching you. We don't see it happen, so it's hard to believe that it's happening. And we don't often catch people watching us because that's kind of a social faux pas. People do this tremendous dance of eye movements to avoid being
Right.
caught watching someone. We've all been there on the subway or something like that. This happens all the time. So we actually started out by bringing this out into the real world, we like to say, outside of the laboratory. So we went to a dining hall on campus and we asked people who were exiting the dining hall a bunch of questions about how much they had been noticing and observing, paying attention to the people around them in the dining hall while they were in there eating lunch. And then we asked a separate group of people how much they thought the people around them were noticing or observing them while they were in the dining hall. And then we asked a separate group of people how much they thought other people were watching other people, right? So it's sort of a more neutral version where it doesn't involve the self. And so that way we can measure both, do people feel like they are doing more social observing than other people are? And also if they are feeling less socially observed than they believe other people are. So we can get all this information just from this quick survey outside of a dining hall. And so what we end up finding is that people think that they are doing the most observing of other people. Other people observe other people a moderate amount, but they themselves are observed the least. And what's interesting is that's between subjects. So in experimental design, something that's nice to do is you can get these questions answered by different groups of people. So they're not making an explicit comparison in their head about how much I'm being watched versus how much I think others are being watched. They're just reporting on one side of that equation. So we found that out in the lab or out in the dining hall, and that was very exciting. And so we brought it into the lab where we could measure actually two people sitting face to face in a waiting room. So we brought people in, we had them sit at a table, we gave them some newspapers and things that they could do while they were waiting for the experiment to get started. So they came in, sat down, and the experimenter said, hey, we're running a little bit behind schedule. Feel free to just do whatever you want while you're out here, and I'll be back when the study is ready to start. And so the experimenter returns after about 5 minutes, having left the participants alone together. And the real reason we had them sitting there was that we wanted to see whether or not they had been observing one another while they were left alone.
There's like never any completely honest social psychology experiments. It's like the people are always being gamed in some way.
That's the fun of it. So we brought people into the back room afterward and we separated them, had them in two different rooms on their own computers, and they're just answering a bunch of questions. So one person is asked about what they noticed and observed about the other person. They basically just wrote out in free form whatever they happened to observe, kind of like an anthropological exercise. And then the other person was asked what they thought the other person had noticed or observed about them, and they just wrote that out. And then afterward, what we did is we had those different write-ups coded by other individuals who knew nothing about the study or the study design or hypotheses or anything. And what we ended up seeing is that even in a situation where there's just two people sitting in a room and they're actually facing one another, even there, people didn't realize nearly the extent to which they were actually being kind of surreptitiously watched by the other person.
That's fascinating.
Which was pretty cool.
Some people overtly try to call attention to themselves. I mean, kind of like the human version of a peacock. You dress a certain way or whatever, you want people to look at you. And then there are other people that I think very consciously would prefer to kind of fade into the woodwork. Does this misconception about the invisibility cloak, does that vary depending on those personality characteristics of the person?
We didn't actually look for that in these studies, so I'm not sure exactly how much personality would play a role. Certainly, there are some people who do like to be the center of attention, and maybe they would actually do things that would make them become more the center of attention. Clear their throat loudly or do something ridiculous.
Yeah, if I wear a mohawk and I'm walking down the street in Des Moines, Iowa, I assume everybody's going to be checking me out who's that guy? Because that's going to stand out there.
Yeah, and there are things you can do, and those things, we could say they put you in the spotlight. So there's actually some classic work that was done in the 90s where they gave people a shirt. So this is kind of like the mohawk example. So they gave people a shirt with a giant face of Barry Manilow on the front. Right? So they gave them this shirt and they had them walk into a room where there was a group of other participants sitting there. And those people, of course, all look up as this person wearing this Barry Manilow shirt walks in. And then they quickly actually pull that person wearing the shirt out of the room and they say, oh, you know what? The other people are too far along in this study. We just need you to answer a few simple questions for us. And they asked the person wearing the shirt how many of the people in the room they thought could name the person on their shirt. And this person, of course, is wearing this shirt they were just given, has a giant face on it, not the coolest person probably at the time for them. And they thought the other people in the room would definitely be able to name the person on the shirt. And it turns out when the people in the room were asked if they could name the person on the shirt, they couldn't, nearly to the extent that the person believed.
Yeah.
And so this has been called the spotlight effect. And so there are ways that you can draw attention to someone. It almost makes them more paranoid, but certain people might seek out that kind of attention and like to think that other people are paying attention to them. But in reality, those people may not actually be paying as much attention to that feature as the people think. So the person wearing the mohawk could think, I have this haircut, everyone is going to be noticing me. Maybe that's why the person decided to cut their hair in that way. But in reality, those people may not be paying as much attention to that feature as the person thinks because that person's so focused on it.
Very interesting. I guess this is just a standard feature of the human brain. I mean, a feature or a bug, but...
Yeah, so the brain is dedicated largely, the human brain, to understanding other people's mental states and thinking about them. But our brains definitely do go haywire in some ways and don't always do this totally accurately. There's actually a really great book if people are interested in learning more about this called Mindwise by a professor at Chicago, Nicholas Epley. And so if you're interested in all the ways in which we try really hard to understand the mental states of others, but this goes wrong, I would really recommend picking up that book.
I could almost sort of see the invisibility cloak illusion as being potentially adaptive in that by being wrong, it avoids this recursive loop. Like if you realized how much other people might be checking you out, then you try to alter your behavior and they realize that and they alter their behavior. You could really kind of just go in circles forever. If you were the type to get socially anxious, like it's almost better that the illusion exists.
Right. That you think other people aren't paying as much attention. I mean, there's good news and bad news, though. I think the good news is other people aren't paying as much attention as you think. But the bad news is that it depends a lot on what we're asking people about. So, for example, we actually had a version of our waiting room study where we tried to induce the spotlight effect. So we gave people a new shirt to wear. It actually had a face of Pablo Escobar on it. We kind of updated it for the times. And we had people walk in this waiting room and they sat down with this other person and went through the same procedures that I just described before. And what we find is that the person who was given this Pablo Escobar shirt is thinking the other person is paying a lot more attention to their shirt than participants who we had who just were in the control condition and came in wearing their own shirt. But that actually wasn't true. So the other person wasn't paying more attention to their shirt when they were given the Pablo Escobar shirt compared to their own shirt. But the other person was paying more attention to them than they realized in general. So there's this sort of difference in whether they're paying attention to the shirt, like a specific feature of the person, or the overall person.
Yeah.
And it turns out we get that wrong. So I'm wearing something new. I'm like, oh my God, that person's noticing it. Turns out the other person's not noticing it, but they're noticing me more generally. And so we're wrong in these specific ways. That's kind of interesting.
This makes me think about how the human brain has special processing devoted to faces and facial recognition. It's something like the shirt that we're wearing. It is almost the exact opposite of that. It's probably least likely to give good clues about what we're likely to do next. So it might be that our brain is actually kind of filtering that stuff for us, or at least, putting perceptual emphasis elsewhere.
Exactly. That's definitely true. And so it's very easy to get wrong what other people are actually noticing because, people are making much more global assessments. As we were saying, when you're with someone new, especially, I think they want to figure you out. They want to know what you're all about, be able to predict your behavior, right? That's one of the best things about understanding mental states is it allows us to know what someone's goals are, what kinds of things they might do, what kinds of things they might do to you. These things are very important to understand, especially thinking kind of from an evolutionary perspective. Yeah, so people are definitely paying attention to these, in a sense, larger scale features that might actually give them information about you as a person. And they're not going to be paying as much attention to these smaller details about you that you know too much about you, I guess is one way of putting it. You know all these different things and people are definitely not paying attention to those. They don't know about them half the time, not nearly as well as you do.
Tell me about some of the other illusion types, the other things that people are consistently getting wrong in our social view of the world.
Yeah, so this is another Air remake, but this is one that I've been looking at more in the context of when we're actually not around other people. So a lot of things I look at are when we're in a social context, the kinds of things that we tend to pay attention to. But this is looking more at the kinds of things that we think other people are thinking about and the times that we think about other people when we're not with them.
Right.
So there's all kinds of things that can remind you of other people, that trigger thoughts about people, memories, funny things people said, or a store someone likes that you happen to be walking by. And you think of other people all the time, right? People are triggered in your mind all the time, but you don't actually text them or get in touch or anything every time that you think of someone, right? That would be crazy.
Yeah, total stalker move at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if only people could see how much other people Facebook stalk them or something, right? It'd be terrifying because it happens all the time, right? People are thinking about other people a lot, but they don't convey that to them necessarily. And we do the same thing. And so we think about other people a whole lot, but we don't necessarily think that they think about us because one of the hallmarks of social life is that we tend to rely on other people's behavior to tell us about them, but we rely on our own thoughts to tell us about us. So we think about other people a lot and we know we do that. We have this tremendous accessibility to our own mind, but we don't have that for other people. So other people's heads are a little bit more like a black box and what we rely on is their overt behavior, the things that they do. And so if someone does pick up their phone and text us or something like that, then we become aware of the fact that they thought about us. But the rest of the time, we just remain pretty oblivious to the fact that that could even be happening.
And what was the experiment design used in this case to tease apart some of these misconceptions that we have?
We just so far have done a first pass at this. So this is very much a project that is underway. But we asked people basically to recall a conversation they had earlier that day. It was a little bit constrained right in time, so we wanted to make sure it was somewhat recent. And then we asked them to report how much they had thought about that person since their conversation with them. And then we asked them also how much they believed the other person had thought about them since that conversation. And what we find is this gap here. So we think that we have thought a lot more about that person since, right? The things that they said maybe resonated with us in a certain way, or they said something that kind of prompted us to think about something a little bit differently, or to go do something. Maybe we talked about a vacation we want to go on, and then I actually went online and started looking into places on TripAdvisor or something. But I kind of think that after the conversation, I faded away from their mind. They moved on to something else. People have a lot on their mind, right? They're busy people.
Right.
And so we just think that kind of the moment fades away after we have it with them. And we know it doesn't. We know it lingers for us. And why don't we also make the correct assumption and that conversation probably lingered for them too? But we tend to not think that. We don't realize that.
It's interesting. Like, I wonder if these studies would be different if they were done outside of America. America's like a very individualist culture. We like to think that each of us is a bright and special snowflake kind of thing. I wonder if you went to an East Asian culture where it's a bit more sort of a collectivist mentality, if this illusion might not be as strong, if we might assume that other people's minds are more like our own and that we're not this unique monolith of individuality.
Yeah, no, that would be really interesting. I could see that being the case too. I think that the more that it's sort of talked about and part of the norms, just to know that other people think about people more, that can feed into how you actually consider that information when you're reflecting on it yourself.
Has there been any pushback from other social psychologists who look at these findings and they think actually maybe the cognitive biases aren't as strong as what your findings are showing? Or is this pretty uncontroversial?
I think they're pretty non-controversial. Yeah, I haven't gotten any specific pushback on people saying, no, people realize this is happening. But like you're saying, there are definitely personality differences that could come into play, moderators of this effect, that kind of thing. But I don't think there's a whole lot of dispute that by and large, we see this trend. And, in psychology, as in any science, it's really valued to replicate your effect over and over and over. It's just one of those things that gives us greater confidence in the fact that this effect is real and can kind of hold over different contexts and different times. And if it doesn't, then to kind of explore that and see what moderators might be affecting it. So, like you're saying, there could be cultural differences, for example, Eastern versus Western cultures. And that would be really interesting to know. And if we don't see the same kind of mind gap effect in Eastern culture, that would just give us more information about what's involved in the effect and how it operates. And so, yeah, you definitely want to replicate. And I feel like that's been one of the things that really makes me very confident in these effects that I've been talking about, is that they do seem to, at least in the ways that we've tested them so far, we haven't exhausted the whole universe of possibilities, but we have tested them in various different kinds of domains on different kinds of people. And so far, we have seen that they do stand up.
How would you like to tease this apart further? Are there particular next studies that you'd like to follow up with?
One thing I would like to do, so kind of going back to the conversation studies we talked about earlier in the liking gap. So how after a conversation with somebody, the kinds of things that you think about in terms of the impression that you gave off to the other person, right? How you reflect on the conversation and how you reflect on it differently than you think other people are. So we found that people think that, they enjoyed the conversation more than the other person enjoyed it. And they would actually like to interact again, but they think the other person wouldn't be up for that to the same extent that they would. And that's actually false. It turns out people in our studies at least have gotten along quite well. And both sides say they'd want to interact again, but both sides say they don't think the other person wants to nearly as much.
Oh, that's so sad.
It is sad. I mean, the good news is it's an illusion. And I think it's helpful to realize that. And this is, one way that we can hopefully learn from these data and improve our lives a bit, is just realizing that these are all illusions. The fact that you think other people don't like you as much, that conversations haven't gone as well, that other people aren't thinking about you as much.
This is like when you find out that the girl that you liked when you were 14 actually liked you, and you find out about it 10 years later, and that whole thing, you're like macroed up to society level.
That's exactly right. So, our biggest fears are not true. That's, I think, is a good takeaway message, is that we can actually realize that other people are going through things in a very similar way to the way that we are. And therefore, that some of our fears just aren't actually validated by the real world. So yes, one area that I want to explore in the future is delving a little bit more into the psychology behind that, into why we think that these conversations aren't going as well as they actually are, kind of objectively or from the other person's standpoint. So I think there's all kinds of things that we do and the ways that we think about the way that we're interacting with people. For example, comparing the way that we behave to our optimal version for ourselves, right? Our standards are high for ourselves often. If you're having a conversation with somebody new, you want to make a good impression, and then you're comparing yourself constantly to the things that you're maybe not doing as well as you think you could do them, or as well as you have done them in the past. Our comparison point for ourselves is different than the standards that we're judging other people by. And so I think it would help us to get a little bit outside of our own heads in that regard, and realizing that other people they have a different comparison set for us than we believe. And so, so I want to explore that a little bit more.
It seems like these are generally pretty optimistic findings, that like the reality is a little bit socially better than we tend to believe. So, I mean, I guess that's an overall reason for optimism.
Yeah, it's a reason for optimism. I agree. And I think that we have to realize it. I think it can be very hard to fully appreciate this in the moments that these social interactions are unfolding, but it would really help us to sort of step away and really realize that that's not how other people are seeing things. So yeah, it's definitely a positive message. I think it can be hard to appreciate it fully and take advantage of that in the moment, but that's what we should all work toward.
So I'm going to crack out my Pablo Escobar shirt and start wearing that in public again.
Exactly. People won't be paying as much attention as you think. So
yeah, exactly. It really is fascinating research that you're doing. And one of the things that's nice about it is that it's universal in its application. It's not just applicable to a really small demographic.
Yeah, well, I think that's like the potential that as a social psychologist, that's what I strive to achieve, right? Is that we have this opportunity to study things that really can impact people's everyday lives and just help us understand ourselves a little bit better and understand our social nature. So that's definitely one of my goals here.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Erica Boothby for taking the time for that conversation. I think the challenge for all of us will be to try to remember those things, and that these aren't just interesting findings in a vacuum that are all about everybody else. They actually do apply to us. But as I mentioned, the problem with illusions is that even when you consciously understand what's going on, it's really hard to look past what your senses are telling you, or in this case, what is probably more of a hardwired intuition. A lot of these issues will come up again in a coming episode when I'm going to be speaking about the fundamental attribution error and other cognitive biases with Dr. Richard Nisbet, probably going down a bit of a rabbit hole recently on ways that our brains miscalculate things. But in the overarching goal for this show to make everybody operate better, myself included, I think that's really important, because if you soup up your brain to be operating really efficiently, you're thinking faster, you're more creative, you're deeply focused, but because of some cognitive bias you're not aware of, you're actually aimed in the wrong direction, then in the grand scope of things, you're just digging yourself into a hole faster. Obviously not the situation we want to be in. So mixing in some of these cognitive self-assessment episodes with the cognitive performance episodes seems like the right move. But for right now, let's move along next to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So if you've ever wondered why you can't tickle yourself effectively, or jump out and say boo and give a good scare to yourself, or how come it is every time you take a step you don't all of a sudden fall over because, oh my gosh, I'm suddenly standing on one foot, you have something called efference copies to thank. And efference copies are really interesting because they are absolutely everywhere in our mental lives, but they are invisible, and invisible by design. This is sort of the technical term for the expectations that we have about what we're about to do immediately next. Like you're doing a fire drill in a school and you tell everybody, hey, there's going to be a fire drill later today. When this happens, you don't need to fear for your life. The principal or whomever, the nerve center of the school, is telegraphing its intention to the body of the school beforehand so that it doesn't catch everybody completely by surprise. And we do this all the time for physical movements. Every time we're going to make a move that's going to shift our center of gravity, if we didn't have this efference copy that we could kind of factor in, it would be much harder to physically operate in the world because each of our own movements would catch us by surprise. And a lot of the early learning that we do is actually our brain learning not just how to initiate movements, but how to correctly send efference copies to the areas of the brain that need to factor those in so that our overall set of movements can be coordinated. And the same thing happens in speech, and efference copies of the words that we're intending to say are sent in almost real time, not just to our mouth and our lips and vocal cords, but also to our brain, basically priming our ears. Hey, here's what you're probably about to hear. Don't be surprised. This is helpful for a lot of reasons. If you're talking with your mouth full or you're drunk and you're kind of slurring and you're mispronouncing things, it's nice to know, wait, that didn't come out like it was supposed to sound from the efference copy in my head. I need to adjust my pronunciation going forward. And one of the longtime assumptions as to what's going on with schizophrenics is that the brain is interpreting efference copies as sounds from the real world, or maybe proto-efference copies, things that you're thinking about saying, but you haven't gotten around to actually pulling the trigger on yet. Those interconsciousness are interpreted as a real voice, and all of a sudden, boom, God's talking to me. But for a long time, a lot of these assumptions about efference copies of vocalizations have been good theories, but basically untestable. But a recent study at the University of New South Wales in Australia decided to look at this, hooking up 42 healthy participants to an EEG, electroencephalogram, and measuring the degree to which when a person imagines a certain sound, that interferes with the brain's reception of the actual sound from the outside world. This study was published recently in the journal eLife, and you can imagine these people looking at a stopwatch, waiting for the hand to hit 0, and at that moment thinking a sound, like thinking the word frog. When the second hand hits 0, you're going to think internally frog, but don't say frog, just think it. And then sometimes at the same time, a speaker in the room would play the word frog or play some other word or not play anything at all. And then sometimes the word frog would play at a time when the person wasn't saying it in their own head. All the time the EEG is running. And so the researchers are able to see how the brain responds to hearing the word internally, hearing the word externally, and hearing the word internally and externally, the same way it would happen if you were saying it yourself. But in this case, it's coming from an exterior source. So you're removing the confounding factor of the person's actual speech. And using this technique, they were able to confirm that, yes, when you're expecting to hear something in the outside world, it actually diminishes the audio portion of the brain's response to getting that signal, says Associate Professor Thomas Whitford, the lead author of the study. By providing a way to directly and precisely measure the effect of inner speech on the brain, this research opens the door to understanding how inner speech might be different with people with illnesses such as schizophrenia. We all hear voices in our heads. Perhaps the problem arises when our brain is unable to tell that we are the ones producing them.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that's it for episode number 215. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/215. If you missed last week's episode, it spoke about the dangerous but highly interesting medicinal compound ibogaine with Dr. Emmeline Maillet. That was in 214. And next week, we're going to be probably having an episode about music and creativity. But just to keep things interesting, it might also have an episode about headaches. So headaches or music, dealer's choice. But I will see you back here next Friday. Same time, same podcast. And with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.